So today we're going to talk about habitat management for upland game birds. Um, Interestingly, I was talking with Dan earlier, and I mentioned that when I was in graduate school back in a different century at Iowa State, we actually had a whole semester course on upland game, and I'm going to try to consolidate all of that into about 45 minutes. So it's going to be sort of tough. It is going to be an overview. I'll do the best I can to keep it moving along. Probably won't have time for many questions on through, but if there's something that's really bugging you, raise your hand, and I'm sure that Dan will see that, and we'll address it either then or we'll address it afterwards. Here's the overview of what we're going to do, the outline of what we're going to do. Talk about annual life cycle of events and related habitat needs to start. Then we'll talk about daily cycles and habitat use. We'll talk about weather and its importance to successful nesting and brood rearing, and also how that relates to fall numbers. I'll briefly talk about ultimate versus proximal drivers of numbers, and particularly habitat being that ultimate one. We'll talk about a little bit, then I'm going to talk a little bit about precision ag, my current project at MSU. And then I'm going to conclude there's 3 or 4 items in the news in upland game birds in Montana, and if you're not aware of them, you should be. Here's my contact information, richard.sojda or Sojda, depending on whether you're American or Polish, at montana.edu. I'm happy to entertain any questions afterwards via email. If you want to talk by phone, my cell is 223-1129, or you can just send me email at that address, and I'll send you my telephone if you don't remember it. I'm going to focus primarily on pheasants, but the general concepts we're talking about today also pertain to sharptails and to huns. Whenever we talk about upland game birds, we always end up talking about habitat problems. Earl Butz, who was Secretary of Agriculture under Richard Nixon back in the 70s, coined the phrase, "We need to plant fence row to fence row." Basically, they were trying to make more and more land available for agriculture, and by golly, they did it. Here's some scenes from some areas in Montana that have been now fairly abused, but you can see the fence row to fence row concept shows up very well in these, particularly in that top left picture. Top right one's an overgrazed pasture, bottom left another overgrazed pasture, maybe not quite as bad, and the one on the right is a grain field that has a fallow strip in it. But we don't really want habitat to look like that. We want habitat to look like this. We want wide fence rows with a lot of grass. We want tall stubble that birds can use all fall and winter long. We want wetlands for them to get winter cover and for escape cover, both from predators and from hunters. And we want large areas of grass for them to nest in. And they need winter cover. We'll talk a lot about winter cover. Bottom right's got a great wooded coulee. That makes great winter cover, as do shelter belts, and we'll talk a lot about cattails as well. Back in the 70s, John Wiegand and his colleagues put together this book as a Pittman Robertson project here with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and it really stands as a great description of what's going on back then in Montana, and it really hasn't changed a whole lot. The basic ecology of upland game birds hasn't changed that much either. The habitat obviously has, but it's about nesting cover, it's about brood cover, it's about food, and it's about winter cover. And John and his colleagues also mentioned predation and water and special needs and some other things, but it's basically about those 4 items: brood cover, food, nesting cover, and winter cover. And those 4 basic habitat management needs for game birds at a local scale are based on their annual life cycle of events. Pretty easy to think that there's 4 of them corresponding with the seasons. They got nesting habitat, brood habitat, fall habitat, and winter habitat. And we'll take and tear apart each one of those a little bit and look at them in more depth. Nesting habitat's the first item to talk about. We want to focus on nest success and hen success. Grass, they really, and particularly for pheasants, they need grass and forbs to conceal the nest and hen from predators. That's true of all upland game birds. We're going to talk a little bit about the difference in the different species. But they need high protein foods for the laying hens. They need to produce those eggs and chuck them out, and they need high protein to do that. And food availability for hens minimizes the time off the nest during incubation. And that if you minimize the time off the nest, you maximize the nest success. So having high protein foods available for those laying hens and easy to gather actually contributes to nest success by minimizing the time off the nest. I'm sure you remember from some of your coursework the difference between nest success and hen success. Nest success is the percentage of nests in an area that are successful, and hen success is the percentage of hens that is successful in a particular area or a particular time period. And the key here is to remember, as I'm sure you do, that upland game birds will renest if their first nest is predated. And so that even though you might have a nesting success failure, if you will, or a low nest success early in the season, because they renest, hen success can actually be fairly good. The early nests tend to be more productive. They tend to be a larger clutch size, and they tend to be set by hens that are a little bit older, so they tend to have greater nest success. But it's really, remember to think about hen success as well as nest success. Nesting habitat for pheasants should be thick and tall. Introduced grasses and alfalfa is okay. Warm season natives are great. This isn't obviously tall grass prairie here, like I have back in the Dakotas and Iowa, Minnesota and such. But still, we have some of that this planet here. Indian grass, big blue stem, some of those. They make great nesting cover for pheasants, particularly if combined with some forbs of some sort. Relatively large blocks are always good. That reduces the amount of predation. It also gives more acres for birds to lay nests in. Sharptails, native prairie is really the best cover you can imagine. Therefore, it's not near as tall and thick, where this is midgrass prairie and shortgrass prairie country here. So it's not going to be that thick and tall like we need for pheasants. But you definitely need large landscapes for sharptails. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's true. I want to go back a second. This pheasant nest, this successful nest on the left is an interesting one. I want to make sure that you recognize that the egg caps are all cut off sort of symmetrically there. That's a good indication that was a successful nest. Obviously, the chicks are here, so we know it was successful. But if we look at this next picture of some unsuccessful nests, sharptail on the left and partridge on the right, see that they don't have that egg cap symmetrically taken off, and the eggs are pretty much mashed in. I don't know if this was a skunk, a fox, or a ground squirrel predation. Ground squirrels often will remove the nests. But in any case, keep in mind what those different predated eggs look like when you're out in the field, so that if you want to get an idea as to what's going on in a particular area, you can get an idea as to what's going on nest success-wise. Great studies in Iowa early on of Iowa pheasants. Nest success was 40% higher in blocks of undisturbed cover, like CRP, compared with linear or small disturbed fragments of habitat. Basically had 25% grass versus 9% grass. I want to make sure I give Bill Clark and Todd Bogenschutz credit for this wonderful paper that they put in the journal. But one of the things that's interesting about their study is, paradoxically, one consequence of limited habitat can be that greater predator populations may also be low, resulting in equivalent nest success, which is interesting. But if you think about that, the part of the problem, those large blocks of undisturbed cover, means you've got more area to put more nests in. And so even if your nest success is the same, you're still going to have a lot more nests in large blocks. If current agricultural policy resulted in large blocks of secure nesting cover that were rotated throughout the landscape, the effects of predation on nesting pheasants might be reduced to the greatest degree. And one of the tenets in Iowa was that if you disturb the area every 5 years to 10 years, essentially you're disturbing predator populations as well and keeping predation down. That's sort of a complex kind of situation, but it can happen. It's something to keep in mind. It's not straightforward. And then I love this quote that Bill and Todd mentioned in there, that last one there. When nesting is restricted to smaller disturbed habitat fragments, pheasant reproduction is probably reduced sufficiently to limit the potential rate of population increase. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. The Golden Triangle up in northern Montana here is an area that used to have a lot of pheasants, but now it's only basically disturbed habitat fragments and a lot fewer pheasants. Talk about sharptails just for a bit. Native prairie is the best, as we mentioned. Therefore, it's not as tall and thick. This is a picture of my buddy going through some fall habitat hunting. But basically, you can see that knee-high kind of grass is great for sharptails. This is ideal sharptail, both fall habitat as well as nesting habitat. And sharptails definitely need large landscapes. Here's a lek, a sharptail lek. I won't go into much detail there, but to mention that the hens that are bred on these leks will nest within a few miles of the lek. And so the leks need to be dispersed across the landscape, and the lek placement and lek numbers really drives numbers, I guess that's one way of thinking about it. The point is that large landscapes need a lot of leks. And so that large landscape issue with sharptails is important. Okay, let's talk about brood habitat. Essentially, when the young chicks are hatched, no matter the species, they need high protein foods like insects and leafy forbs. Here's an area along the Marias River, north of Great Falls, that would be great brood habitat for pheasants and a little bit too thick maybe for sharptails. It'll work for them too. There's been a lot of effort in planting pollinator habitat across the state lately, particularly pushed by Pheasants Forever, the NRCS, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and obviously some others that you can see here on the sign. But not only does it provide green, leafy, high protein vegetable food, if you will, but it also attracts all kinds of insects and invertebrates into those kinds of habitats. And that's really what's driving the brood success by giving them lots of food to eat, making it easy for them to grow. Talk a minute about fall food and escape cover. On the upper left there, you see actually a sharptail crop cut open that shows rose hips with a side order of grasshoppers. That's pretty classic kind of food habit that you'll see in hunter shot birds in the early fall, mid-fall, even into late fall. I've actually shot birds and seen grasshoppers in them into December, when you would think they would all be gone, but somehow they find them. As the fall turns closer and closer to winter and the temperatures drop, the birds need to shift from high protein foods to high carbohydrate foods. In that bottom left, milo and millet and sorghum makes great food, as does corn. And those are the kind of foods that have high carbohydrates packed into them, and that's what the birds are shifting to as the season gets colder. There, the dog pointing a pheasant and cattail slough is in the fall, but that cattail kind of habitat makes great escape cover and hiding cover for pheasants, and not so much for sharptails, but particularly for pheasants, to some degree for sharptails. And that's really important at this time of year. Here's another example of good fall habitat, riparian area with some cattails and willows. This is out at Headwater State Park, but it would make great fall habitat. Winter habitat really need thermal cover and escape cover, of course, not only from predators, but from hunters as well, and just general disturbance. And then you need food availability, and that food needs to stay available even if during snow events and after snow events. This one, I think I mentioned, is in the Gallatin Valley here. Maybe I didn't. It's in the Gallatin Valley here, and not too far from where Eider's pointing this hen pheasant. There's a whole group of pheasants that are feeding on bales that have been stacked along a crop field. So that was their food source. And the cattail sloughs were where they were escaping to, and that was their other cover. The bottom right-hand picture shows just a wonderful shelter belt up in northeastern Montana in Sheridan County. As you can see, the wheat stubble, with wheat or barley actually, in the foreground there. It'd be a great place for the birds to eat. They can come out of that shelter belt and find all kinds of food until it snows, and then the snow might hide some of that food source, make it a little bit less available to the birds, and so that's an issue. But food plots can be planted, and if you have a food plot near a shelter belt like this, then you've got the best of all worlds. Pheasant food plots should be close to escape and thermal cover. In the front, you can see the grasses, and then right in the back there, you see the corn as for the food. This is on a BLM ground just east of Billings. But what you can't see in the picture, which is just as important, behind that corn is the Yellowstone River and all kinds of wonderful, wonderful riparian habitat, thick riparian habitat, a lot of reed canary grass, sedges, a little bit of cattail and that kind of thing. That makes great, great cover for pheasants. As I mentioned earlier, another example of riparian cover. It's always good escape cover, and it always makes decent thermal cover as well. Cattail sloughs are almost always the best thermal and escape cover that you can imagine. They're just thick, wind doesn't get through them, temperatures in there are warmer. When I did my radio telemetry study on pheasants in northwestern Iowa and in prairie pothole country there, I was working in large cattail sloughs, 1,000-acre, 1,200-acre, 800-acre sloughs. And those birds, those radioed birds, never left those sloughs for the course of the winter. They were, even though this is Iowa and there's all kinds of corn and soybeans around these sloughs, they were finding enough seeds from wetland annual plants in the mudflats. I was working in a drought, and they found enough food there. They never really had to leave those sloughs to actually get out and feed. And so cattail sloughs can be pretty spectacular cover. Okay, if we take a quick review of the annual life cycle of events and habitat needs, we talked about nesting cover, we talked about brood habitat, we talked about fall habitat, and we talked about winter habitat. In the interest of saving time, I'll just leave that at that. The other thing I do want to mention here too, though, is this idea that fall habitat can become winter habitat itself. If you've got good thermal cover, they can just stay there, and fall habitat sort of transitions into winter habitat. But the other thing that can happen as well is fall habitat can be a conduit, if you will, or a corridor from an area to better winter habitat. And you'll often see that happen with pheasants and sharptails both. So fall habitat can become winter habitat. It can also be a conduit for getting to winter habitat. Let's talk a little bit about daily cycles and habitat use. This is outside the nesting season. Daytime threats that pheasants and upland game birds have evolved to deal with raptors, and to not so much evolve, but also deal with hunters, dogs, and recreationists. Nighttime threats they've evolved with are basically mammalian predators, to some degree owls, but that leaves a typical daily routine with lots of variation. They leave the grass roosting areas at sunrise, they feed in grain fields, they loaf in midday in plum, chokecherry, Russian olive, buffalo berry kind of thickets. Those thickets prevent aerial predators, or not shouldn't prevent, but lessens the threat from aerial predators, because they can't fly through and nail the birds as quickly in those thickets. Then they go out back into the grain fields in mid and late afternoon, and then they return to nighttime roosting areas like grass and cattails to spend the areas in wide, big areas of cover where ground predators like foxes and coyotes have less opportunity to find them, because they have to search wider and wider areas and then in smaller areas. So basically that idea that they're leaving those grass and roosting areas, feeding the grain, staying in the thickets midday, and then going back to grass in the evening, or sloughs, which is what it says on the bottom there. Few miscellaneous points. Standing water is not really needed by pheasants. Water requirements can be met by dew, insects, and succulent green vegetation. But insects, green shoots, and thick vegetation are often associated with water, like riparian areas, springs, and wetlands. So I'll often hear people say to me, you know, I always see pheasant tracks down by the slough or by the stock pond or, the water tank. I assume they're going down in there for water, aren't they? And really, they're not. They're going down in there because those areas, because they have water, essentially have more vegetation and more insects. And that's why they're being attracted to those wetter areas, not for the water per se. There was a group with the Illinois Natural History Survey, I think this was back in the 60s, don't remember for sure, had a game farm in Illinois, and they basically took some areas and put pheasants in there and gave them no standing, no free water, just green vegetation and grain, and they survived just fine. They laid eggs, they hatched the eggs out, they did just fine without any standing water. And that's where a lot of that information that I just mentioned in terms of not needing water comes from that one study. I don't think it's anecdotal. And that's not to say that birds won't drink freestanding water, but they can get by without it. I want to talk just a little bit about ultimate versus proximal factors affecting population levels. Thinking back to some of your basic ecology, I suspect you remember the difference between ultimate and proximal. Proximal being those immediate kind of things in a small area. Ultimate things being those things over a long term that really affect what you're seeing in the numbers of birds. And before I forget, don't forget about the multivariate model and how ultimate and proximal factors interact. So that, we know that the ultimate factor, and we're going to talk more about this for pheasant numbers, is good habitat. But proximal factors like weather also contribute. And remember that the number of birds that you see this year are not, in this fall, for instance, are not just based on what happened that year, but also based on the number of birds that have been there for the last few years and how that population sustains itself. There's an area in northern Iowa called the Winnebago Study Area that a lot of pheasant research was done on years ago. And this is, I think, a great graph. If you look at that, I think it's yellow, could be green. I'm colorblind, but that lighter colored line that says land and row crop. If you look at that increased dramatically from the 1940s to the mid 70s. At the same time, the potential nesting cover dropped. Of course, what was happening is they were plowing up grass and pasture and nesting cover and oats, not growing oats anymore for horses, and putting it all into corn and soybeans. In the process, as you can see from this graph, the fall population of pheasants just plummeted. This is a classic case of showing that the ultimate cause of sustaining pheasant numbers is habitat. This is on that same area. Top left, you got the research area in 1941. Bottom right, you see it in 54. You're seeing some field consolidation starting to happen, seeing some nesting areas starting to get pulled out. Top left, now you're looking at 67. Bottom right, 73. You're seeing more and more consolidation, larger and larger fields, less and less nesting cover. And then as the study ended in 76, this is what it looked like. And if you compare it over those 25 years, there really was drastic change. The size of fields, the amount of pasture, hay, and oats for nesting cover plummeted. Marshes and wet meadows were taken out. I think there's a field, a hedgerow that was taken out, not hedgerow, a shelter belt that was taken out on a farmstead. So basically, essentially, we eliminated habitat, and as you eliminate good habitat for pheasants, you eliminate the pheasants. Pretty straightforward, but I think it shows a really good story. Bill and Todd also had this comment in their paper, and I just like it as well. There was increasing evidence that fragments of quality habitat and a matrix of agricultural fields were not adequate to support large pheasant populations. This is the classic case that we see up in the Golden Triangle here in Montana, north of Great Falls. Used to be tremendous numbers of pheasants when fields were smaller and there was a lot more nesting cover. And now you go up there and you see that it is planted more and more fence row to fence row, less and less good quality habitat, and it's the number of pheasants has dramatically decreased. Think about some proximal factors now. Hen success and brood success drive fall numbers. Predation and habitat quality influence particularly hen success, but weather drives both, especially the latter. And that, I think it's in yellow, what I'm emphasizing there, the cool, wet weather at peak of hatch results in poor production, poor numbers of birds. Extreme drought and lack of invertebrates for chicks can also have negative effects, but really what drives fall numbers and throughout the pheasant range is the weather at the peak of hatch. If it's cool and wet, the birds just don't, the little chicks just don't survive. Al Ferris's book, The Ringneck Pheasant in Iowa, is a classic. I just love this Maynard Reese painting, and so I wanted to include that. That's where all those graphs and figures and stuff that I showed earlier of the habitat change in that Winnebago study area are in there. If you really have an interest in pheasants and upland game birds, you really ought to read that. It's an easy read. It's an hour kind of read, semi-technical is all, and it really tells the great story of what's going on with birds in their habitats. A few miscellaneous points. We'd like to be able to relate a lot of this nesting stuff and numbers to habitat and to landscapes. Really haven't been very good studies done on pheasants in relation to landscapes, modern kind of landscape kind of studies. We're lucky here at Montana State that Lance McNew and Animal and Range Sciences has done some outstanding work with his students on sharp-tailed grouse and looking at movements and metapopulation concepts. And hopefully we'll see some more of that. And it would be just awesome if we could finally start to see some of that kind of work in the Western US on pheasants. It would teach us an awful lot. For further reading, I also recommend you take a look at the Upland Game Bird Enhancement Program Strategic Plan. It's got great information in it, and you can learn an awful lot by taking a look at that. It's available online at the Fish, Wildlife, and Park site. That's what I have to talk about in general about concepts for game birds and their habitat. What I want to talk now about is precision ag a little bit and some of the work that I'm doing here at MSU with Pheasants Forever and John Deere. The purpose of the project is to demonstrate through the use of technology and collaboration that farmers will increase their profitability while simultaneously providing benefits for wildlife habitat along with soil and water health. The equipment these days, as you're well aware, is all GPS tied together. These guys are especially, I'm familiar with the John Deere stuff, taking data off at about a square meter basis on these fields and automatically uploading it to the John Deere cloud. And it's just a great data source to show what's going on in those fields. They also have things like this sprayer that I showed here. It's called a Sight and See. And basically, there's enough algorithms now, a lot of them based on artificial intelligence, that are able to turn the sprayers on and off as the tractors are going through the field to curtail spraying. And the idea, of course, is to reduce the input so you increase your profitability. But from an ecological perspective, the less chemical that's out there, obviously, the better as well. But the basics of our project, I contact John Deere dealers to identify potential producers that might be interested. I work with those guys once they grant us access to their data in their field data, which is also obviously in the John Deere cloud. And then I take that cloud data and I provide yield maps for each field. And I do this as a surrogate to return on investment analysis, and we do this at no cost to the farmer. And essentially, we don't have good information on cost of production in Montana in small grain. And so basically, we're using yield as a surrogate for return on investment. When I'm finished, we sit down with the farmers and turn their stuff over to the field biologist with the farmer's approval. And they work with local chapters of Pheasants Forever and wildlife agencies, NRCS and others to implement conservation practices on land with that poor yields, that poor return on investment where the landowner is interested. None of this is done without full collaboration and interest of the landowner. Well, how can it help game bird conservation? Well, here's an example. In this year, 16% of this barley field yielded below 70% of its long-term yield. The cost of production likely exceeded the income on those areas. When this pattern repeats itself over time, the producer is better off not farming that portion of the field. It shows poor return on investment. When I sit down with a map like this and show it to a producer, they usually know what areas of their fields aren't producing year after year. But this really makes it hit home, and they begin to realize that these areas are where they're actually not just not making money, they're actually losing money. And so then we can use that as a door to open to talk about conservation practices on those pieces of property. So far, I've worked with 3 cooperators. I've done harvest data and analyzed maps on about 20,000 acres of cropland on hundreds of fields, and identified about 300 acres for habitat improvement. And they're in the process of working with NRCS and Pheasants Forever and Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to do those habitat improvements. Okay, that's what I had to say about precision ag. I will mention now, I have an article that I've written for Pheasants Forever magazine that's supposed to be coming out here in the next week or two. If that comes out and I can get a PDF copy of that, I'll get that to Dan, and he can share that with you so that you can read a little bit more about it, what's going on in Montana here. Items in the news. 4 things I really want to mention. Number 1, there's been an environmental assessment that's being prepared. Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Commission has proposed releasing 50,000 ringneck pheasants on state lands across Montana starting this particular year. There's an extension of upland bird hunting seasons through January 31st that's been proposed. We have been trapping and transplanting sharp-tailed grouse from eastern to western Montana, and there's an update of the Upland Game Bird Enhancement Program plan that's in the process too. Talk about each one of those separately. The proposal to release up to 50,000 ringneck pheasants per year has started by a proposal to convert the state prison's dairy farm at Warm Springs to a facility to raise pheasants for release across the state. The expectation is that the release of these birds will help recruit, retain, and reactivate hunters by giving them more birds to shoot, particularly for new hunters and young hunters prior to the season when they have their special hunts for the kids. It's not supposed to be an attempt to sustain pheasant numbers or start new populations. We all know that release of game farm birds doesn't really help pheasant numbers. However, there's a lot of people that are suspect of some of the what's going on with this particular program. It'll be interesting to see where that environmental assessment goes with that. If you follow things on social media these days, you'll see that there's been a fair amount of criticism, and it seems to be growing for releasing that many pheasants across the state, and that effort, that money, and everything else should be really targeted more towards habitat improvements and habitat management rather than growing game farm pheasants. Don't have enough time to talk about all the ins and outs of that right now, but that assessment is going through, and they'll be taking comments, I believe, through the end of February. If you go to the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks site and look at the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Commission, you'll see the opportunity to comment. Also, there's an extension of upland bird hunting season that's scheduled or proposed through 31st of January that the commission is considering. And there's a lot of questions about that. And if you look on social media, you'll see a lot of questions coming up, whether that's really a good idea or not. Probably is not going to affect the numbers of birds harvested because there's going to be probably not a lot of birds, a lot of hunting pressure that's going to be happening in January. You got snow issues, you got access issues, a lot of issues that sort of happen at that point. Another question is that the number one that I have there, will the effects be the same for species where only males are harvested versus the others? In other words, there's thought that if you were to extend the seasons for pheasants, you're probably not going to have too heavy of an impact on the population. If we start doing that for huns, for sharptails, where you can't really distinguish between the males and females on the wing, as well as mountain grouse, maybe there might be some local populations that could take it in the shorts being over harvested. Whether that's true or not, we don't know. but it's a question that's being raised. And then the other question that's being raised is, does late season hunting and disturbance affect the breeding condition of birds? Does it just make it more, give them more time to be exposed to predation and to not come through the winter in such good condition? No one knows the answer to that either. And then the other question that comes up that no one knows the answers to is the block management areas, the BMAs. Will the people that are in those programs be willing to extend their invitations another month? And there's some thought that this proposal is meant to, as a way of incentivizing outfitters and those people that are trying to monetize wildlife in Montana for basically put and take, and not so much put and take, but pay for hunting. And question is whether that's a good idea or not. Certainly it doesn't follow the traditional model that we've been following in Montana. So there's lots of questions about this, and this will be fun to watch in the news and see what happens. One of the things that I've suggested is that we really need to, if we're going to make such a change like this, we really need to start collecting data and evaluate it scientifically. I don't know if that suggestion has fallen on non-deaf ears yet, but hopefully that's something that might happen. Other item, we've been trapping transporting sharp-tailed grouse from eastern Montana to western Montana, where they've basically been extirpated. Last fall, we trapped 75 birds and moved them to western Montana, outfitted them with radios, hoping for another 150 more to do this spring. If you're interested in participating in that trap and transport, I suggest you contact Lance McNew. He's been a key player in getting sort of this organized. And then Ben Diebel with the Big Sky Upland Game Bird Association is really the one that's been sort of leading that effort. There's a fellow in Fish, Wildlife, and Parks up in region, up in the Northwest. I forgot if that's region 1 or 2 where he is. But in any case, if you contact Ben or you contact Lance, you can get more information about that. The last point I want to mention in terms of items in the news is the Upland Game Bird Enhancement Program plan, which was written, I think, back in 2011, is being updated. It was supposed to have been done last year, didn't get finished, so they're still working on it. But there's lots of opportunity to comment on that too, if you'd like. If you look at the Upland Game Bird Enhancement Program website on Fish, Wildlife, and Park site, you can get more information there about that as well. Okay, today we looked at the fact that all habitat is framed by the annual life cycle of events of birds. We've talked that different seasons have different requirements, habitat-wise. We talked about nesting cover, brood rearing cover, fall foods and escape cover, winter thermal cover and adjacent food. We talked about the difference between ultimate and proximal effects on numbers, particularly habitat versus weather. And we talked about precision ag and hopefully simultaneously being able to improve farmers' bottom lines and habitat for game birds. Here's my contact information, richard.sojda or Sojda, depending whether you're American or Polish, at montana.edu. Happy to correspond by email. My cell number is 223-1129. If you want to get in touch with me that way, you're welcome to. Or if you don't remember that number, just send me email to that and I'll send you my phone number and we can talk. With that, I'll be happy to entertain any questions in the last couple of minutes that we have.
Rick, very nicely done. We're at the hour for them to transition if they need to for the next class, but if anybody wants to stay around, I'm sure that Rick would offer a few more minutes for question and answer, but thank you for lending your expertise to this group. It's important information and better to hear it from you than from me. Thank you very much, Rick.
You're welcome.
Yep, and to the esteemed individual who has a birthday today, happy birthday to you and best wishes today and into the future. You managed to retain your anonymity throughout the class in spite of my best efforts to root you out. Happy birthday. Thanks, Rick. And if you wanted to ask him some questions, you can come forward and do so virtually. Otherwise, I think we're at dismissal time in 10. Do we dismiss now or at the hour? Oh, Rick, it's all a big false alarm. Who wants to ask a question? Sir, let's see. Did you say they should come up?
If you want to ask questions, you can walk up to the podium and ask them in person because I don't think the microphone can.
Rick, it's my mistake. We've got 7 minutes left, but come on up.
I can see your face.
And who else had a question? You could just come forward and be able to offer it. And thanks for telling me that we have 7 more minutes, Rachel.
Hi, Rick.
Howdy.
My name's Jack, and I just had a question about kind of if you've done any research about this area and just kind of how Bozeman is just developing more, and just has that had any effects on any upland game bird populations around this area?
The short answer is no, in terms of actually having done any research or collecting any data. Anecdotally, because I'm an avid bird dogger, certainly a lot of the areas that I used to be able to find partridge and sharptails and pheasants on for training dogs and for hunting around Bozeman have disappeared. Clearly, a lot of those are literally apartment buildings or houses now. So we have just eliminated habitat, a lot of habitat. But in terms of actual numbers, I don't think anyone has any good data. That's a great question.
All right. Hi, Rick. I'm Ben. I just have a question for you about the sharptail reintroduction as far as in Western Montana.
Mhm.
It was really just more of a question of why, I guess how nowadays that was extirpated in the West, whether or not it was more habitat loss or if it was related to hunting.
I don't think anyone knows for sure, but clearly habitat loss is the main thing. And clearly Western Montana was more on the fringe of sharptail range. And so when you're on the fringes of the range, you're going to have a greater opportunity to extirpate something. We've talked about that at the grouse camp and no one really knows a clear answer for that. But there have been, one of the interesting things about that is they have done some genetics work and have shown that the birds that they took out of museum collections, and as well as ones, a few that are existing, are the same genetic makeup as the birds in eastern Montana. They're more the plains birds than they are the birds that are across the divide in Washington and Oregon. So they felt that those birds would be a good place to capture birds and move them to Western Montana. They basically, but what they're doing is they're releasing the males that they caught last fall, and they only released males on where they knew there were historic leks, and those birds tended to stay on those areas. And then in the spring, they're going to trap both males and females and release them again on those historic leks. Hopefully the males, because they're radioed, will know where they are, and so they can release the females right on where they establish their leks in the spring as well, and really optimize the chances for success. Optimize doesn't mean guarantee, but it's a cool project.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Others, I was definitely premature. We have 5 minutes. Any more questions? Yeah, we have another person coming up to offer you a question, Rick. So hang on a minute.
Sure.
Hi, Rick. I'm Luke. I had a question for you regarding the project you're working on with the farmers and preserving habitat. So
Yeah.
you said those areas you had marked out for preservation because they weren't profitable for the farmers. What would be the exact management practices you recommend for those farmers on those properties?
It really depends on the area specifically. A lot of those areas are wetter areas. If that being the case, maybe a little ditch plug to try to encourage canary grass or cattails for some winter habitat would be great. In other cases, it might be areas that have been eroded off, hilltops, where the native soil is now sort of gone. And so what you might be able to do there is plant grass cover and develop nesting areas. And it really depends too on what the farmer himself wants or herself, in terms of they maybe want to put in a food plot or a shelter belt or something like that. Those are all possibilities as well. Oftentimes, one of the limiting factors is a lot of these areas, because they tend to be wet, tend to be higher in alkali, and so they tend to be areas that it's hard to establish things on. So you're limited in terms of what you can use in terms of plant species, but there's always something that'll grow there.
Thank you.
Does that answer it?
Yes.
Okay.
So what kind of response have you gotten from landowners, Rick, to your data and the associated program?
Well, right now, we're probably going to have about 300 acres of ground that's going to be converted into some sort of conservation plantings this year.
Okay. Others? Thanks again, Rick. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, glad to do it.
Yep, we'll follow up and we'll post this on the D2L site for the students to have your outline available. And I think you'll get a recording from Rachel. Yep. Okay,
Excellent.
thanks, Rick. We'll sign off.
See you guys.
Yep, bye-bye.